Thank you. It's my great pleasure to introduce this presentation of Los Pastores, an ancient folk drama whose music and story inspired John Donald Robb to compose the cantata that we'll hear this evening. We're grateful to the New Mexico Performing Arts Society and El Rancho de las Golondrinas for making this presentation possible. A little bit about John Robb, who's been gone now these many years. He was a successful attorney who practiced international law in New York City. He was also an accomplished cellist, a great outdoorsman and adventurer, and was filled with endless enthusiasm. My second favorite fortune cookie said, "Enthusiasm tames beasts, it charms brutes." It's true. According to his son, John Robb Jr., his father had taken him skiing when Jr. was only 12 years old. They caught sight of a 70-foot ski jump, and young John asked his father if he'd ever considered skiing off of a ski jump, whereupon Robb Sr. mounted to the top of the ski jump, sailed through space, demonstrating to his son that one can do anything that one puts one's mind to if one has the courage and the resolve. In 1939, Robb transported his family to Taxco, Mexico, then a beautiful community south of Mexico City. There they rented a house, and Robb spent some time listening to local musicians perform their traditional music. He invited some of these musicos to come to the house, where he would hastily scribble down the notes as they performed the music, transcribing the music. And it was there that he developed this abiding love affair with la música de la gente of the Hispanic New World. And I sure understand that because it's beautiful. Robb moved his family to New Mexico in 1941, where he joined the ranks of earlier New Mexico Lord Trovers, including Aurelio Espinosa, Juan B. Rael, Arthur Campa, and Jenny Wells Vincent, who recently died at the age of 102. Just think of that. And she had her wits about her right to the very end. Robb began to collect Hispano folk music throughout New Mexico and beyond. He used a wire recorder, if you can imagine such a thing, that he hooked up to the battery of his car, and that's what he had to do to go out and record all of this music. And he placed the microphone so that he could try to get both the vocalists and the instrumentalists to all sound about right. He did a terrific job. When you think about the equipment he was using at the beginning of it, that's extraordinary. Robb Jr. said of his father that he really had an abiding love for the musicians themselves, and, quote, "The singers were not just performers. They were genuine people, and he loved genuine people." Robb had been deeply influenced by the great Hungarian composer, ethnomusicologist, and folk music collector Béla Bartók, who had himself recorded Hungarian, Slovak, Roma, Bulgarian, and Algerian folk music on a gramophone. Now, I'm wondering here in this audience, who remembers Nipper the dog staring into the horn of the gramophone that became the icon for RCA Victor? Yeah, that's what he recorded on. Boy. Bartók and his friend and fellow composer Zoltán Kodály incorporated folk melodies and rhythms that they had recorded into their musical compositions. And Robb, who was a great admirer of Bartók, began to follow the same practice by incorporating Hispano folk music of New Mexico into his own compositions. Bartók was born in 1881, 11 years before Robb, who was born obviously in 1892. Bartók died in 1945, and he had to stop recording folk music at the very beginning of World War I. It just was not a good place to be out there with a gramophone recording folk music, apparently. But it's curious to me that Rob's career as a collector began the same year as the beginning of World War II. Gradually, Rob shifted to recording monoraurally on a tape recorder. I guess he got his wires crossed or something. His collection of folk songs numbers at nearly 3,000, and it's stored at the Center for Southwestern Studies at the Zimmerman Library at the University of New Mexico. John Robb became my friend. Jenny Wells Vincent introduced me to Rob in El Paso in the 1970s at a joint meeting that included the New Mexico Folklore Society. I'd begun recording Hispano instrumental folk music for the film Los Alegres that came out in 1976. From 1942 to 1957, Rob had distinguished himself as the Dean of the College of Fine Arts at the University of New Mexico. Dean Rob, as he became known, enthusiastically invited me to visit him in Albuquerque, which I did. He welcomed me into his home, and he was this very conservatively garbed man in suit and tie and somewhat formal in his demeanor. I came to respect him. How could you not respect somebody who went out and recorded on a wire recorder hooked up to the car battery? I've often wondered if he ever got the battery to die and he couldn't get home. That's the way it goes. I described some of my own early adventures to him. I'd recorded folk music in the Sierra Madre of western Mexico and the Cook Islands in the South Pacific. And collective enthusiasm overwhelmed all of the formality, and we began to talk in earnest. Dean Robb told me of many of his own adventures recording folk musicians who had since died and who would have carried their repertoires to the grave if Rob hadn't recorded them before they died. He also gave me the names and phone numbers of several folk musicians whom he'd recorded who were still living, including Pete Maese down in Las Cruces and Edwin Barry in Tomé, New Mexico. I subsequently recorded about 247 songs performed by Edwin Barry, as well as his recollections of the lore of Valencia County. Thus, I was well launched in my own adventure as a collector of folk music and lore, of oral history, I spell that A-U-R-A-L, that I continue to do to this very day. Soon I was visiting Dean Robb on a regular basis. He just completed his magnum opus, Hispanic Folk Music of New Mexico and the Southwest, which was finally first published by the University of Oklahoma Press in 1980. A second edition was recently published by the University of New Mexico Press in 2014. And boy, what a tome it is. It's about 4 inches thick, and it's really full of good stuff. One day, Dean Robb invited me into a side room in his home, and therein was his new Korg synthesizer, which I think was about vintage 1977. An amazing looking device, I have to say. He sat down at the keyboard, and his distinguished countenance vanished and was replaced by a look of mad glee. His hair stood up just as though he'd been shocked by a big jolt of electricity, and his fingers crashed down on the keyboard, and away he went into the musical shadows of his mind as he performed the sketch of a new composition for me. It was an amazing moment. I was transfixed watching and listening as the barrier between two men who were separated in age by over 4 decades vanished. We shared a common denominator. We loved and performed music. We were driven to record the music of the people who belonged to the land of the Southwest. We found ourselves haunted by melodies that emanated from a culture capable of deep profundity and great expression of spirit. John Robb remained my friend till his death in 1989. Within 10 days, the death of Harriet, his wife of 68 years. Wow, married to the same person for 68 years. The last time I saw Rob was at the Museum of International Folk Art in Santa Fe in 1988, immediately after he had attended a concert of Hispano folk music that my great friend and collaborator Enrique Lamadrid and I had produced. John Robb and I shook hands, looked each other in the eye, and wished each other Godspeed. Incidentally, Rob finished the original score of Los Pastores shortly before his death. And this score has only recently been re-orchestrated for the ensemble performing this evening. Now, I want to say this presentation is made possible by funding from the First National Bank of Santa Fe, the University of New Mexico John Donald Robb Musical Trust, the McCune Charitable Foundation, New Mexico Arts, and the Santa Fe Arts Commission. And this rare, very rare performance is directed by Franz Boat and features members of the New Mexico Bach Society. And now I want to introduce Dr. Enrique Lamadrid, eminent folklorist and ethnomusicologist, who will introduce and narrate this ancient musical folk drama, Los Pastores, that was so beloved by John Donald Robb that he incorporated its music into this cantata. Thank you.
The basic plot of Los Pastores comes directly from Luke 2, verses 1 to 20, the only gospel to pick up the story of the shepherds. Their journey to Bethlehem, with all of its physical and metaphysical obstacles, is an allegorical search for divinity within humanity. They are pilgrims on the road of life to a better place. Angels serve as messengers, powerful guides, and allies. Although there are no fallen angels until much later in the scriptures, well-spoken, silver-tongued devils appear in the folk play to tempt, deceive, and hinder the journey. The shepherds' arrival in Belén to see the Holy Child, the Santo Niño, is a true people's epiphany. The three kings will arrive when they arrive, but remember that the shepherds, a stand-in for you and me, got there first. In the songs and dance of their improvised adoration, the pastores are the first conversos, the first Christian converts. They offer the child the humble gifts they carry with them: cloth, food, and animals. What they receive in return is grace. This simple story has been rewritten and restaged in myriad forms over many centuries to express the social and spiritual aspirations of the people. John Donald Robb loved the soulful music of Los Pastores, like a child loves a lullaby. These Christmas plays with shepherds in search of epiphany and grace are performed all over Greater Mexico on both sides of the border. Robb visited and recorded them, all of them he could find. He sang Alaru, the cradle song of the Holy Child, to his own grandchildren. Robb's New Mexican folk opera Little Joe began with that song. His field work concentrated on the pastorela of Los Griegos, right there in Albuquerque, not far from the university. Robb's legacy was his life's work of collecting, composing, and performing. One of his last visits to UNM was in 1986 or 7 to see Filomena Baca's long-term production of La Gran Pastorela de Belén, hosted by the Maxwell Museum of Anthropology. And Filomena is here with us tonight. I'll acknowledge her in a second. The curators graciously placed 2 chairs well forward so that Robb and his wife Harriet were literally part of the play. The cast surrounded them as fellow shepherds and angels and regaled them with song and a touching tribute, a musical farewell. We still remember that ephemeral moment. Thank you.